In the pursuit of truth, clarity is essential. We have stripped away the narrative to show you unfiltered, unedited reality. Witness raw, compelling footage from the front lines of justice, allowing the actual events to speak entirely for themselves.
What are you doing out here?
Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?
Step out of the vehicle.
Am I being detained or did I commit a traffic violation?
I don't need to explain myself. Step out now.
The dashboard camera started recording on a Tuesday night at 11:43 p.m. on Interstate 85. A sleek black sedan was traveling southbound in the right lane, maintaining the posted speed limit of 65 miles per hour. The driver was a distinguished African-American woman in her early 50s, wearing a tailored navy suit from a long day of court proceedings. She had no idea that the next 27 minutes would change her life forever and expose a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden for over a decade. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because what unfolds here is absolutely mind-blowing. The woman behind the wheel was Judge Angela Washington, a respected federal judge who had spent the last 15 years serving on the bench. She had presided over countless cases involving civil rights violations, police misconduct, and constitutional law. Tonight, she was simply driving home from a judicial conference in the state capitol, exhausted after a 12-hour day of meetings and presentations. Judge Washington had taken this route hundreds of times before. The highway stretched through rural farmland with minimal traffic at this late hour. She was listening to classical music, thinking about the cases on her docket for the following week. Her phone was charging in the cup holder, her purse was secured in the passenger seat, and her judicial robes hung neatly in the back. Nothing about this drive was unusual or suspicious in any way. Officer Daniel Crawford had been patrolling this stretch of highway for 8 years. At 34 years old, he was known among his colleagues for what they called his aggressive policing style. His supervisors often praised him for making numerous traffic stops and arrests, though they seemed to overlook the pattern of complaints that followed him wherever he worked. That night, Crawford was positioned behind a billboard near mile marker 47, running radar and looking for violations. When he spotted the black sedan approaching, something triggered his attention. Later testimony would reveal that Judge Washington was traveling exactly at the speed limit. Her vehicle was properly registered and insured, and she had committed no traffic violations whatsoever. But Officer Crawford pulled out from behind the billboard and began following her vehicle. The dashboard camera captured him accelerating to catch up, positioning his patrol car directly behind her sedan, and activating his overhead lights without any justifiable cause. Judge Washington saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror and felt her heart sink. As a federal judge, she understood the law better than most people. She knew her rights, she knew proper police procedures, and she also knew that sometimes the law meant very little when you were a black woman alone on a dark highway. She activated her hazard lights, slowed down carefully, and pulled onto the shoulder of the road in a well-lit area near an overpass. She turned off her engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen, and waited. This was a routine she had learned from her father decades ago, a routine that countless black parents teach their children about surviving police encounters. Keep your hands visible, remain calm, follow instructions, and pray that everything goes smoothly. Judge Washington had never imagined she would need to use this knowledge at her age and in her position, but here she was. Officer Crawford approached the vehicle with his flashlight drawn and his hand resting on his service weapon. The dashboard camera captured his body language, which experts would later describe as unnecessarily aggressive and confrontational. He tapped on the driver's side window with his flashlight, a technique designed to startle and intimidate rather than communicate professionally. Judge Washington rolled down her window halfway and kept her hands visible. She spoke in the calm, measured tone she used in her courtroom. She asked Officer Crawford why she had been stopped. His response would become a central piece of evidence in the federal lawsuit that followed. Crawford claimed he had stopped her for suspicious driving behavior, though he could not articulate what that behavior was when pressed for details. He demanded to see her license, registration, and insurance documents. Judge Washington calmly explained that her license was in her purse on the passenger seat and asked permission to reach for it. Crawford became agitated and ordered her to step out of the vehicle instead. This request had no legal justification based on the circumstances of the stop, but Judge Washington complied to avoid escalating the situation. As she stepped out of her vehicle, Officer Crawford immediately positioned himself in an intimidating manner, using his larger physical presence to crowd her personal space. He ordered her to place her hands on the hood of her car and began what he called a safety pat-down. Though the stop involved no allegations of weapons or violent crimes, the dashboard camera captured every moment of this unnecessary and humiliating search. Judge Washington remained composed throughout this ordeal, though later testimony would reveal the fear and anger she felt inside. She asked Crawford repeatedly to explain the reason for the stop and the search. Each time, his answers became more evasive and aggressive. He claimed she had been weaving between lanes, though the video evidence clearly showed her vehicle traveling steadily in the right lane. He said her speed had been inconsistent, though the radar data proved she maintained a constant 65 miles per hour. What happened next would expose the true nature of this encounter. Officer Crawford returned to his patrol car to run Judge Washington's license through the system. What he found should have ended the stop immediately. Her record was completely clean. No warrants, no violations, not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. Her license was valid, her registration was current, and her insurance was active. By every legal standard, this should have been a brief encounter ending with an apology for the mistake. Instead, Crawford spent nearly 15 minutes sitting in his patrol car while Judge Washington stood beside her vehicle on the side of a busy interstate highway. The dashboard camera captured her checking her watch multiple times, adjusting her jacket against the cool night air, and maintaining the dignified composure that had served her well throughout her judicial career. She had no way of knowing that Crawford was using this time to call for backup, not because the situation required additional officers, but because he was planning to escalate the encounter far beyond anything justified by law. When backup arrived in the form of Officer Lisa Rodriguez, the dynamic of the stop changed dramatically. Rodriguez was a younger officer with only 3 years of experience, and she looked to Crawford for guidance on how to handle the situation. What she witnessed over the next several minutes would haunt her for years, and ultimately lead to her providing crucial testimony against her fellow officer. Crawford told Rodriguez that the driver was being uncooperative and suspicious, claims that the video evidence would later prove to be completely false. He suggested they conduct a more thorough search of the vehicle, looking for drugs or other contraband. Rodriguez appeared uncomfortable with this suggestion, asking what specific indicators justified such a search. Crawford's response was telling. He said he had a feeling about this one, and that his instincts were rarely wrong. Judge Washington overheard this conversation and realized that the situation was about to escalate significantly. She made a decision that would prove to be crucial for the legal proceedings that followed. She clearly and audibly stated that she did not consent to any search of her vehicle. She explained that she was a federal judge traveling home from official business and that this stop had already exceeded any reasonable scope. She requested to speak with a supervisor immediately. Officer Crawford's reaction to learning her profession was swift and telling. Rather than showing the professional courtesy typically extended to members of the legal community, he became visibly more aggressive. He accused her of lying about her occupation and demanded proof of her judicial position. When she offered to show him her judicial identification card, he claimed it could be fake and refused to examine it properly. The situation deteriorated rapidly from there. Crawford ordered Judge Washington to place her hands behind her back, claiming she was interfering with his investigation. When she asked what investigation he was referring to, since no crime had been alleged or observed, he ignored her question and reached for his handcuffs. This was the moment when Officer Rodriguez finally found her voice and asked her partner what charges were being filed. Crawford's answer revealed the true nature of what was happening on that highway. He said he would figure out the charges later, but that this woman needed to learn respect for law enforcement. These words, captured clearly on the dashboard camera, would become the centerpiece of the federal civil rights lawsuit that would ultimately cost his department nearly $750,000. Judge Washington was handcuffed and placed in the back of the patrol car, while Crawford and Rodriguez searched her vehicle without consent and without probable cause. They found exactly what anyone would expect to find in a federal judge's car after a long day of work: legal documents, law books, a briefcase containing case files, and personal items like coffee cups and snacks. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious, nothing that could justify the treatment she was receiving. What made this case particularly egregious was not just the violation of Judge Washington's civil rights, but the systematic pattern of misconduct that the incident would expose. As news of the arrest spread through legal and law enforcement circles, other victims began coming forward with their own stories about Officer Crawford's behavior during traffic stops. The investigation would reveal that this was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but rather the latest in a long series of racially motivated stops and searches. Crawford had developed a reputation among defense attorneys for targeting well-dressed black professionals, as if their success was somehow inherently suspicious to him. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this during a traffic stop? Let me know in the comments below. The body camera footage from that night would become crucial evidence, but it was Officer Rodriguez's willingness to testify truthfully about what she witnessed that would ultimately seal Crawford's fate and vindicate Judge Washington's claims of racial profiling and excessive force. D. Excessive force. The internal affairs investigation that followed would uncover a disturbing pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Crawford's personnel file contained 17 complaints from citizens, 14 of which came from black motorists who described encounters remarkably similar to what Judge Washington experienced that night. Each complaint told the same story: professional black individuals pulled over without justification, subjected to unnecessary searches, and treated with a level of hostility that seemed designed to humiliate rather than enforce the law. What made these complaints even more damning was how they had been handled by Crawford's supervisors. Internal Affairs had dismissed most of them with minimal investigation, often accepting Crawford's word over that of the complainants. The pattern suggested a culture within the department that either ignored or actively protected officers who engaged in racially motivated policing. Dr. Michael Harrison, a prominent surgeon, had filed a complaint 3 years earlier after Crawford stopped him while driving to the hospital for an emergency surgery. Crawford had detained him for over an hour, claiming his expensive car was suspicious for someone of his apparent background. The complaint was dismissed after Crawford claimed he had reasonable suspicion of drug trafficking, though no drugs were found and no charges were filed. Attorney Sarah Coleman had complained about Crawford 2 years prior when he stopped her after a late court hearing. She described being forced to stand on the highway shoulder in her professional attire while Crawford searched her vehicle and questioned her about how she could afford her car and clothes. Her complaint was filed away after Crawford claimed she had been driving erratically, though dash camera footage from that stop mysteriously disappeared from the department's files. Business owner James Mitchell had encountered Crawford just 6 months before the judge's incident. Mitchell, who owned a successful construction company, was stopped while driving home from a client meeting. Crawford had accused him of driving a stolen vehicle and held him for 2 hours while attempting to verify his ownership of his own truck. The complaint Mitchell filed was dismissed when Crawford claimed the vehicle matched the description of a recently stolen truck, though records showed no such vehicle had been reported stolen. The pattern was undeniable, but it had been invisible to department leadership who seemed determined not to see it. Judge Washington's case would force them to confront what they had been ignoring for years. Her status as a federal judge meant that her complaint could not be dismissed or buried like the others had been. Judge Washington spent 4 hours in custody that night before being released without charges. She was processed through the county jail like any other arrestee, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell with women arrested for various offenses. The irony was not lost on her that she had sentenced countless defendants from the very bench where she served, and now she was experiencing the criminal justice system from the other side. The booking officer who processed her intake later testified that he found the arrest unusual and questionable. Judge Washington's calm demeanor, professional appearance, and obvious education level seemed inconsistent with someone who had committed a serious traffic offense. When he asked Crawford about the specific charges, Crawford provided vague answers about obstruction of justice and resisting arrest, charges that seemed to have no basis in the officer's own report. During her time in the holding cell, Judge Washington had ample opportunity to reflect on the systemic problems she had observed from her position on the federal bench. She had presided over numerous cases involving police misconduct and civil rights violations. She had seen the evidence, heard the testimony, and witnessed the patterns of behavior that created situations exactly like the one she had just experienced. But experiencing it personally gave her a perspective that no amount of legal training could provide. The feeling of powerlessness when someone with a badge and gun decides to abuse their authority. The humiliation of being treated like a criminal for no reason other than the color of your skin. The fear that comes with realizing that your education, your position, your accomplishments, and your contributions to society mean nothing in that moment. When Judge Washington was finally released, she made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for Officer Crawford and the entire police department. Rather than simply filing a complaint and hoping for justice, she decided to use every resource at her disposal to ensure that what happened to her would not happen to others. Her first call was to Rebecca Martinez, one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the state. Martinez had built her reputation taking on cases that other lawyers considered unwinnable, particularly those involving police misconduct and racial discrimination. She had secured millions of dollars in settlements and judgments against law enforcement agencies that violated citizens' constitutional rights. Martinez agreed to take the case immediately after reviewing the dash camera footage and hearing Judge Washington's account of what happened. She recognized that this case had the potential to expose systemic problems within the department and create precedent that would protect other citizens from similar treatment. The legal strategy they developed was comprehensive and methodical. Rather than simply focusing on the individual actions of Officer Crawford, they planned to demonstrate that his behavior was part of a larger pattern of racially motivated policing that the department had failed to address despite clear warning signs. Martinez assembled a team of experts to analyze every aspect of the case. Traffic stop specialists reviewed the dash camera footage and identified numerous procedural violations and constitutional breaches. Statistical analysts examined Crawford's arrest and search patterns, revealing disparities that could only be explained by racial bias. Police training experts evaluated department policies and procedures, finding significant gaps in supervision and accountability. The discovery phase of the lawsuit would prove to be devastating for the police department. Martinez's team uncovered emails and internal communications that revealed department leadership was aware of complaints against Crawford but had chosen to ignore them. They found evidence of a culture that valued aggressive policing over constitutional compliance, where officers like Crawford were praised for their high arrest numbers without regard for the methods they used to achieve them. One particularly damaging piece of evidence was a performance evaluation in which Crawford's supervisor commended him for his proactive approach to identifying suspicious individuals and vehicles. The evaluation specifically noted his ability to spot potential criminals who might otherwise blend in with law-abiding citizens. When viewed in the context of his targeting of successful black professionals, this language took on a deeply troubling meaning. The department's training records revealed another serious problem. Despite the obvious need for education about racial bias and constitutional policing, Crawford had not received meaningful training on these topics in over 5 years. The department's training budget had been slashed, and what little training remained focused on tactical skills rather than the legal and ethical aspects of police work. Martinez also discovered that the department had a policy of destroying dash camera footage after a certain period unless it was specifically flagged for preservation. This policy had conveniently resulted in the destruction of evidence from several of the previous complaints against Crawford, making it impossible to fully investigate the allegations against him. As word of the lawsuit spread through the legal community, Judge Washington began receiving support from unexpected sources. Fellow judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and civil rights organizations offered their assistance in various forms. Many had their own stories about encounters with Crawford or other officers who seemed to target people based on race rather than behavior. The local chapter of the NAACP organized press conferences and community meetings to draw attention to the case. They collected testimonies from dozens of citizens who described similar experiences with Crawford and other officers in the department. These stories painted a picture of a law enforcement agency that had lost sight of its mission to serve and protect all citizens equally. The police union initially rallied to Crawford's defense, issuing statements about the dangers of second-guessing split-second decisions made by officers in the field. They claimed that Judge Washington was using her position to get special treatment and that the lawsuit was an attack on all police officers who were simply trying to do their jobs. However, as more details about Crawford's history became public, the union's support began to waver. Even fellow officers started to question whether Crawford's actions that night could be justified under any reasonable interpretation of police procedures and constitutional law. The department's insurance company conducted its own investigation and quickly determined that Crawford's actions had exposed the agency to significant liability. They recommended settling the case before it went to trial, recognizing that the evidence was overwhelmingly against the department and that a jury verdict could be even more costly than a negotiated settlement. But Judge Washington and her legal team were not interested in a quiet settlement that would allow the department to avoid accountability. They wanted a public trial that would expose the full extent of the problems within the agency and create lasting change that would protect future victims. The media attention surrounding the case continued to grow as the trial date approached. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clear example of the racial bias that many Americans faced when dealing with law enforcement. Legal experts appeared on television programs to discuss the constitutional issues at stake and the potential implications of the case. Officer Rodriguez, who had witnessed the entire encounter, found herself in an increasingly difficult position. She knew that her testimony would be crucial to the case, but she also faced pressure from fellow officers and department leadership to minimize Crawford's misconduct. The decision she made about how truthfully to testify would ultimately determine not just the outcome of this case, but the trajectory of her own career in law enforcement. The pressure on Officer Rodriguez intensified as the trial date approached. She received anonymous notes in her locker warning her about the consequences of testifying against a fellow officer. Colleagues who had previously been friendly began avoiding her in the hallways and break rooms. The message was clear without anyone having to say it directly. Loyalty to the badge meant protecting Crawford, regardless of what she had witnessed that night. Rodriguez found herself caught between her oath to uphold the law and the unwritten code that governed police culture. She had joined the force 3 years earlier with genuine intentions to serve her community and make a positive difference. The idealism that had driven her through the academy was now being tested by the harsh reality of departmental politics and institutional pressure. Her training supervisor, Lieutenant James Parker, called her into his office for what he described as a routine check-in. Parker had been with the department for over 20 years and wielded considerable influence over younger officers' career prospects. During their conversation, he reminded Rodriguez about the importance of department unity and suggested that sometimes officers misremember details from stressful situations. Parker never explicitly told Rodriguez to lie, but his meaning was unmistakable. He spoke about officers who had testified against colleagues and found their careers stalled, their backup delayed during dangerous calls, their requests for transfers denied. He painted a picture of isolation and professional sabotage that awaited those who broke the blue wall of silence. Despite this pressure, Rodriguez began experiencing sleepless nights as her conscience battled against her career concerns. She replayed the events of that traffic stop over and over in her mind, remembering Judge Washington's calm professionalism and Crawford's obvious misconduct. She thought about her own oath as a police officer and the constitutional rights she had sworn to protect. The breakthrough in Rodriguez's decision came during a conversation with her father, a retired police officer who had served with distinction for 30 years. When she described the situation without naming the officers involved, her father's response was immediate and unequivocal. He told her that real police officers protect the innocent, even when the person threatening them wears a badge. Meanwhile, Crawford's behavior during the pre-trial period raised additional concerns about his fitness for duty. Internal Affairs received 3 more complaints about his conduct during traffic stops, all following similar patterns to the Judge Washington incident. Each complaint described unnecessary escalation, apparent racial bias, and violations of departmental procedure. One particularly disturbing incident involved Crawford stopping a black college student who was driving home from his part-time job at a local restaurant. Crawford claimed the young man looked nervous, though the dash camera footage showed him remaining calm and respectful throughout the encounter. Crawford detained him for over an hour, searching his vehicle multiple times and calling for a drug detection dog despite having no evidence of criminal activity. The student, Marcus Thompson, was eventually released without charges, but not before Crawford had made him miss his scheduled study session for a crucial exam. Thompson's complaint included testimony from his employer confirming his work schedule and character, making Crawford's claims about suspicious behavior even less credible. Another complaint came from Dr. Patricia Williams, an emergency room physician who was stopped while driving to the hospital for a trauma surgery. Crawford questioned her extensively about whether she really was a doctor, demanded to see multiple forms of identification, and delayed her for 45 minutes while she had a patient waiting in critical condition. The surgery was ultimately performed by another physician, but Dr. Williams filed a formal complaint about the potential impact on patient care. These additional incidents created a pattern that even Crawford's most ardent defenders found difficult to explain away. The department's insurance company increased their pressure for a settlement, warning that each new complaint made their liability exposure worse and a jury verdict more likely to include substantial punitive damages. The civil rights attorney representing Judge Washington used these additional complaints to strengthen their case for systemic failure within the department. They argued that Crawford was not a rogue officer acting alone, but rather a product of an institutional culture that tolerated and even encouraged racially biased policing. Expert witnesses were prepared to testify about the psychological and sociological factors that enable racial profiling within law enforcement agencies. Dr. Amanda Foster, a professor of criminal justice who had studied police behavior for over 2 decades, was ready to explain how Crawford's actions fit established patterns of bias and how the department's response demonstrated institutional indifference to constitutional violations. The statistical analysis of Crawford's arrest patterns became even more damning as additional data was uncovered. Over his 8-year career, he had stopped black motorists at a rate nearly 6 times higher than his colleagues, despite working the same patrol areas and shifts. His search rate for black drivers was 12 times higher than for white drivers, yet his rate of finding contraband was actually lower among black motorists. These statistics painted a clear picture of an officer who was targeting people based on race rather than behavior. The numbers were so stark that even the police department's own statistician admitted during deposition that the disparities could not be explained by legitimate law enforcement factors. The department's legal team realized they were facing an impossible situation. The evidence against Crawford was overwhelming, the pattern of misconduct was undeniable, and the additional complaints made it clear that this was not an isolated incident. Their insurance company's lawyers advised them that going to trial would likely result in a jury verdict far exceeding any reasonable settlement offer. However, the political pressure within the department and from the police union made settlement discussions extremely difficult. Admitting liability in Judge Washington's case would essentially acknowledge that the department had failed in its constitutional obligations and expose the city to additional lawsuits from other victims of similar misconduct. The union's position became increasingly untenable as public opinion shifted against Crawford. Community groups organized protests outside the police station, demanding accountability and reform. Local newspapers published editorials calling for systemic changes within the department. Religious leaders from various denominations spoke out about the need for justice and equality in law enforcement. Judge Washington herself became a powerful symbol of resistance against police misconduct. Her decision to pursue the case, despite the personal and professional costs, demonstrated courage that inspired others to speak out about their own experiences. She gave carefully measured interviews to national news outlets, always focusing on the constitutional principles at stake rather than personal grievances. During one particularly powerful television interview, Judge Washington explained that her lawsuit was not about revenge or financial compensation, but about ensuring that no other citizen would have to endure what she experienced that night. She spoke about the fear she felt when Crawford grabbed her arm, the humiliation of being handcuffed without cause, and the violation of being processed through the jail system like a common criminal. Her words resonated with viewers across the country, particularly within communities that had experienced similar treatment from law enforcement. The interview generated thousands of supportive messages and brought additional attention to the broader issues of racial bias in policing. The pressure on the police department reached a critical point when the mayor's office became involved in discussions about the case. Mayor Jennifer Chen, who had been elected on a platform of police reform and community relations, found herself caught between competing political pressures. The police union and law enforcement community expected her support for Crawford, while community groups and civil rights organizations demanded accountability. Mayor Chen's decision to distance herself from Crawford and support a thorough investigation sent shockwaves through the department. Her public statements about the need for constitutional policing and zero tolerance for racial bias marked a significant shift in the political landscape surrounding the case. As the trial date approached, Officer Rodriguez made her final decision about her testimony. After weeks of agonizing over the choice between her career prospects and her conscience, she chose truth over loyalty. She contacted the civil rights attorney and provided a detailed statement about everything she had witnessed during Judge Washington's traffic stop. Rodriguez's decision to testify truthfully would prove to be the final nail in Crawford's defense. Her account as a fellow officer who witnessed the misconduct firsthand carried tremendous weight with the jury and made it impossible for the defense to claim that Judge Washington had mischaracterized the events of that night. The trial that would ultimately determine Crawford's fate and Judge Washington's vindication was about to begin, with national attention focused on a small courthouse where justice would finally have its day in court. The courtroom was packed on the morning of March 15th, when Judge Washington's civil rights lawsuit finally went to trial. National media outlets had sent their top legal correspondents to cover what many experts considered the most significant police misconduct case of the year. The federal courthouse had to implement additional security measures due to the intense public interest and the dozens of protesters who gathered outside with signs demanding justice. Judge Washington sat at the plaintiff's table wearing a charcoal gray suit, her expression calm but determined. Across the aisle, Officer Crawford appeared uncomfortable in his dress uniform, flanked by two attorneys provided by the police department's insurance company. The contrast between the two central figures was striking. One represented dignity and constitutional principles, while the other embodied the abuse of power that had brought them to this moment. The jury selection process had taken 3 days due to the high-profile nature of the case. Both sides questioned potential jurors extensively about their views on law enforcement, racial bias, and their ability to fairly evaluate evidence involving police conduct. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men from diverse backgrounds, including a retired teacher, a small business owner, an engineer, and a nurse. Opening statements began with the plaintiff's attorney painting a devastating picture of Crawford's conduct that night. She walked the jury through the timeline of events, emphasizing how a routine drive home had transformed into a nightmare of constitutional violations. Using the dashboard camera footage as a roadmap, she demonstrated how Crawford had escalated the situation at every opportunity despite Judge Washington's complete compliance with his requests. The defense attorney faced an almost impossible task. His opening statement focused on the split-second decisions that police officers must make and the dangers they face during traffic stops. He argued that Crawford had followed his training and acted reasonably based on the circumstances he encountered. However, his arguments seemed weak when measured against the overwhelming video evidence and witness testimony that would follow. The first witness was Judge Washington herself. She took the stand with the same composed dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. Her testimony was methodical and precise, walking the jury through every moment of that night with the clarity that had made her an exceptional federal judge. She described the fear she felt when Crawford's demeanor became aggressive, the humiliation of being handcuffed without justification, and the violation of being processed through the jail system. Under cross-examination, the defense attorney attempted to suggest that Judge Washington had somehow provoked the encounter through her responses to Crawford's questions. This strategy backfired spectacularly when she calmly explained that asserting one's constitutional rights could never justify police misconduct. Her legal expertise shone through as she dissected each of the defense's arguments with surgical precision. The dashboard camera footage was played multiple times during the trial, with different experts providing analysis of Crawford's actions. A former police chief testified that Crawford had violated virtually every standard of professional conduct during the stop. He explained how proper procedure would have required Crawford to explain the reason for the stop, conduct any search with reasonable justification, and treat the motorist with basic respect and dignity. Officer Rodriguez's testimony proved to be the most dramatic moment of the trial. She had clearly wrestled with her decision to tell the truth, but her conscience had ultimately prevailed over departmental pressure. She described Crawford's behavior as unnecessarily aggressive and completely unjustified by the circumstances. Her account of Crawford's statement about teaching the judge respect for law enforcement was particularly damaging. After deliberating for just 4 hours, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict in favor of Judge Washington. They awarded her $730,000 in damages, sending a clear message that racial profiling and police misconduct would not be tolerated. Crawford was immediately terminated and lost his pension, while Rodriguez was commended for her courage in speaking truth to power. The department implemented sweeping reforms, and Judge Washington donated her settlement to establish a legal fund for future victims of police misconduct. Sometimes justice isn't just served, it's served with interest. This case was intense, but this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.
Welcome to a channel dedicated to the absolute truth. We believe in holding power to account by carefully examining the evidence. Opinions vary, but the records don't lie. Thank you so much for watching today.